Okay, so I'd suggest we make a start. We've got a good participation here, and I think we've got a great panel for today's discussion. So first off, good morning to everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today for what should be a really fascinating discussion around a really topical discussion for today around resilient and net zero global value chains. Now, I just want to start off with a kind of a disclaimer on definitions and different words we might be using. Of course, a lot of these are interchangeable. We talk about supply chains. That word will probably pop up. Value chains. Some talk about demand networks is probably more suitable. But whatever the case, I think we know what we're referring to here. It's about that global network, particularly the end-to-end global network of moving supply from out of the ground, processing, producing those components, and then through to final assembly of the products and back to customers. So just to start off, my name is Nigel Pakench. I'm a partner with Kearney in our strategic operations practice. We've been doing a lot of work recently with our clients, understanding the context of today's changes in terms of supply chain resilience, the drivers, the need for resilience, and how to really build that resilience into value chains, and the sustainability required of supply chains to drive long-term resilience, let's say. And myself, my personal background, 15 years with Kearney now, and I've always been a specialist in supply chains, in supply chain design. So really a fascinating time to be working through the topic. I'll be moderating this session myself, and just for a kind of brief introduction on what we'll be working through, I'll set a bit of the context up front, just a few minutes to set the scene here. I'll then move on to introducing our four panelists, and the four of them will have a chance to introduce themselves briefly. Then we've got some kind of key questions that I'll just walk us through and ask each of our panelists to kind of jump into the discussion. I think it'd be really helpful. I'm sure there are a lot of questions out there, so it'd be great to spend at least 15 minutes or so towards the end with an audience Q&A, so everyone gets a chance to throw in some questions, get the discussion going, and then we'll move on to a quick kind of wrap up and ask for some of the key themes coming out of the session. Okay, so I just want to start off here by thinking back myself to 2015. And I mentioned, I've done a lot of work personally in designing supply chains. Back in 2015, it feels like a long time ago now, much more benign business environment. We were looking at, fairly stable, predictable volumes, predictable demand, and opening up supply networks, costs, prices under control, in many cases reducing. And the logic of setting up supply chains was, that paradigm was fairly well established. We were optimizing for cost, cash, and service. We were looking for economies of scale and then moving products to the cost customers. Things started getting complicated. We're all very familiar in our own different ways of all of these challenges, but more and more extreme weather events have been happening. We've been looking at more and more cyber threats, stoppages as a result of COVID. 2020, if we think back to that first half of 2020, really demand cliffs, and then it was demand surges. We've been looking more recently at labor shortages, port congestion, all the rest of it. So the context and parameters of global value chains has really shifted. I think we're all aware of it. It's really front page in the news at the moment as well, and has really become a critical topic to solve. And that's a big part of the reason we want to spend this hour discussing the topic. Now to bring it on to the topic of today, I mentioned optimizing our value chains for cost, cash, and service. Now, clearly, that's not enough anymore. Running that optimization won't get to the results we need. Really now, it's about adding into the mix of those drivers, both resilience in the sense of allowing systems or enabling systems to return back to a steady state when they've experienced some kind of shock or disturbance, So that's more of the shorter term, managing these disruptions, but then also building in sustainability to supply chains. And that's really about the longer term, ensuring that those global value chains that we're running are sustainable, are net zero, and are contributing to the amelioration of the climate situation rather than against it. So that's the longer term aspect. And yeah, none of us can be sure of what the next black swan could be, the COVID type event, but it's very clear. I think that climate change is the next big wave of change. Some might say it's the next pandemic, and in many senses we don't have a vaccine, a simple vaccine to be able to inoculate against this change. It's happening in real time. It's happening in slow motion all around us. We're seeing the effects of it, and it's the root cause of many of those disturbances that I mentioned as well. So what's clear is we need to rethink how we design global value chains from two different perspectives that I mentioned there, both in terms of the long-term addressing the root causes of climate change, and we're thinking here, particularly sustainability, addressing the root causes, and thinking particularly about reducing carbon and contributing to the net zero targets that came out of COP26. Over the shorter term, though, of course, resilience goes hand in hand. We need to mitigate against the impact of these shocks. We can't let global value chains be knocked over, supply stopped essentially. We need to ensure global value chains keep doing what they're supposed to be doing and getting the product downstream to the customers and ultimately to consumers. And the reason we put those two together in this session is because we really do believe the two need to happen in parallel. We need to address those root causes at the same time as we set up global value chains to manage the shorter term risks and mitigate against them. Now I just want to talk briefly about the why as well. Now the why, of course, we know a big part of it is contributing to the net zero target. But the other aspects that's really come into sharp relief in recent times is that, achieving resilience, it's not just a matter of operational tweaking and improvements here. It's a matter of really market leadership versus being at the losing end of markets. And recent events with semiconductor chip shortages have shown us that. Recent research, well, it's hot off the press. But looking at industrial OEMs that rely on those semiconductors over the recent year or so when those shortages kicked in, those that were able to be agile and secure supply actually gained market share. And we're looking for the leaders of kind of 10 to 15% or so versus the laggards in the same sector. So this really is real. It's an existential threat, both from a climate perspective, but also from the economics. Okay. Now I'd like to move into more of the how of that question. How do we address these changes? What have been the big trends? How do we really operationalize some of these changes? And that's where I want to turn to our panel here. We've got a fantastic panel today. I'm really happy to be moderating this session. I think we should pull out a lot of great findings. And I mean, the thing that really strikes me is in the to bringing together a cross-section of different actors within global value chains, that's part of the secret to success in building, new revolutionary value chains. It's bringing together the operators, the logistics, the technology, the thought leadership, and of course the business behind it all. So to my left, we've got Magdi Batato, who is Executive Vice President and Head of Operations at Nestlé. We have Julie Gerdeman to his left, CEO of Everstream Analytics. We have, Jag next, to her left, Dr. Jag Srai, who is Director of Research at the University of Cambridge's Department of Engineering and really a thought leader in the space. And we have Ryan Peterson, CEO of Flexport. So I think a really great panel here, looking forward to the discussion. I'd just like to start us off by asking each of our panelists for a 1 minute or so introduction to yourselves and why this topic is important for you.
Yeah, I am myself a multicultural person. And I think that it is important to, when we talk about sustainability, as individuals first, to take into consideration all the varieties that we see around the world, because one size does not fit all. And that suits so well with Nestlé, because we are spread in a lot of countries. And it's important to understand those challenges, to find the right solutions. It's at the heart of what we do. We are an agro-based company, and we want to, improve on our footprint. We want to be part of nature-based solutions. It's food, and food is at the center of, the sweet spot. How can we do sustainable business? How can we transform the food systems to be able to feed 9 billion people by 2050? So for all those reasons, personally, culturally, as well as a business, I think this is at the heart of what we are doing.
I'm Julie Gerdeman, and at Everstream Analytics, we're a technology company. We provide predictive analytics, so actionable insights to help customers manage the risk in their supply chain. And we believe that risk underpins everything. I think if we've learned anything, risk is just, disruptions will continue. The volatility and the focus on them have certainly come into the spotlight. The way that we do it is we collect big data, lots of data, and we leverage artificial intelligence on top of that data. So we're running algorithms to find the patterns and the trends, to be predictive and then prescriptive with our customers. And then we enrich that with human intelligence. So we have data scientists and analysts in every time zone around the world to supplement that. So we call it, a million eyes, boots on the ground. So like the others here, I believe that this is a team sport. I think that's really what Nigel was saying, bringing us together. Supply chain is a team sport. We're all in it together, and that's how we're going to make a difference. And companies that leverage this and leverage technology we're finding a competitive advantage.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jag Srai. I'm a Director of Research at the University of Cambridge. It's an 800-year-old startup, for those of you who haven't come across us. I've been 20 years in Cambridge, but prior to that, looking at manufacturing supply chains and how to look at digitalization technologies, new production technologies. I also co-chair Global Food Security Interdisciplinary Research Center at Cambridge, which is 24 departments looking at food security, just showing how complex that problem is. But I wanted to touch on, prior to being in academia, I spent 17 years with Unilever, and not a dissimilar company to Nestlé and Magdi's organization. And so actually, what I'd like to really share today is this interlinking between public and private organizations. Is these problems of this nature need a collaborative effort between private companies, between institutions and universities, to make sure we're not looking at today's problem, but looking a little bit further ahead.
Hey, great to see everybody. I'm Ryan Peterson. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Flexport. We're a technology platform for global logistics, for global trade. We started this business in 2013, and I want to kind of just set the stage of the last 8-9 years has been pretty crazy. That's the time that I've been in the global logistics industry. So in 2014 was a normal year, it was pretty fine. 2015, he mentioned, was pretty straightforward, but actually that was the year on the west coast of the United States. We had a port strike and everything shut down. You couldn't import anything into the United States on the west coast. 2016, the price of ocean freight fell to the lowest we've ever seen pretty much in world history. It was like $600, $700 to ship a container from China to the US. Those of you buying containers recently know that's not the price today. 17, 18, 19, we had a trade war and a new tariff regime every couple of weeks. 2020, we all know, pandemic, demand cliff. 2021, port congestion. 2022, we've got a war in Ukraine disrupting things. It has been wild, and yet our company during that time grew from 2014 was our first year in business where we had revenue $2 million. This year, forecasts are hard to follow through on, but we're projecting to do $5 billion in revenue. So it's been it is possible to grow through these things. The key, I think, is to be agile, and I think that applies to every business today. And the principles of agility and where technology can really help with this is that you must be very good at observing the world and seeing what's happening around you, and then putting that information into context. What are the decisions who needs to know about this information? What are the teams that need to form to take action, make a decision and take action, and sort of run that loop over and over again? And this is where I think technology can play a big role. Layering on sustainability is yet another complication. I think one of the things that we need to put on people's radars, especially 2023 going into that, is there's new regulations coming out from the International Maritime Organization next year to reduce the carbon emissions from ships, where ships will probably have to go slower to achieve these goals. You can expect lots more changes to come, and that's the principle of agility is be ready for whatever change, because if you're better at adapting to this than your competitors are, you'll be better at serving your customers, and you can fight through the friction and overcome it. So that's, I hope helps to set the stage for this discussion. It's a messy world out there, and I don't think there's no normal for us to return to, is my core view of it all.
Absolutely. And thanks, Ryan, and I totally agree. Agility has to be part of the solution. It can be a term that needs defining. So hopefully we can put some of the tangible, what does agility really mean, behind that in this session as well. But I just wanted to start off, Magdi, with yourself, and just hear a little bit more about what Nestlé has been experiencing over the past few years in terms of changes to global value chains, particularly the drivers behind those changes, and then looking forward, what you're expecting in terms of both the challenges but also the opportunities in changing global value chains.
Maybe firstly, through COVID, we all learned a lot of things. And I think we were quite resilient and quite agile. And I'll try to bring few points why is that so. And those could be points that we will, of course, pick up for further evolution of how value chains should look like. Firstly, three things that come to my mind. Firstly, design. We are, of course, a company that has a broad footprint, and we are lucky with that. So we were kind of more resilient than other companies that were linked to specific geographies. The second one is really a bit cultural. We are a decentralized organization. And a decentralized organization, meaning you trust the people that are operating in your markets. One size does not fit all, as I said. And then they get on with it and they find own solutions. We actually had only 3 top-downs during COVID. Number 1, we told our people, take care of your own health and safety. Number 2, ensure supply. And number 3, give a helping hand to communities around you. Ensure supply meaning, do not worry about stocks, because in a company you have many KPIs that are contradictory sometimes. So we made it simple, and it worked. And the third one, of course, is, apart from the culture aspect, is, of course, the overall agility of the value chain. And for example, when we had a lot of in-home consumption versus out-of-home, we had to revive very quickly lines and products that were on the edge of being sold eventually, because they simply are part now of an important thing, which is in-home cooking and things like that. So when I look at all of that, so of course, competence and capabilities of our people is key. So investing in your people and capabilities. You need to invest in competence of people in the value chain. You need to ensure that you have a value chain which connects well the consumer with the upstream part, with the supplier. And I think I don't like anymore to talk of value chain. I think the value chains of the future are no longer chains. They are more circles. There is a feedback loop from consumer directly to supplier. And for that, you need sometimes tools and technology. We started something we call connected planning. And what connected planning is about is linking the demand sensing to the supply and production planning. Why is this important? Because in times of high volatility, it's extremely impossible to be accurate in your demand. I mean, we had so much volatile demand out there in the market. None of us has a crystal ball that can say, okay, this is going really to happen. So if you have some of those tools that help you in understanding consumer behavior based not only on historical trends, but based on experiences and feedback loops, and this is starting now to help us. We are implementing this on the go. The other one, and it was mentioned a couple of times already, is collaboration. It's no longer, it's an ecosystem. So you need to collaborate with technology players. You need to collaborate with suppliers. We are working, you alluded to ocean. And of course, we are collaborating with our suppliers of ocean maritime freight with solutions that are more sustainable, hydrogen or otherwise. And we need to buy into these solutions. So to get resilience, to get agility, to get circularity, you need the right design, you need the right culture, the right mindset, and you need the right capabilities. So these are few of the examples that we went through, what we learned and what we want to continue. Because the supply chains have been deglobalized, and that's why it's important also to, and we were kind of global, we were kind of deglobalized by nature, and that has helped us a lot.
Thanks, Magdi. I wonder if any other panelists want to add to that, because I think there were a couple of really interesting themes that came out of it. Firstly, you mentioned kind of connecting, end-to-end is a nice word, but when you describe it as connecting the upstream supply chain and suppliers going through the tiers with the downstream, and really getting a view of the full complexity of these global value chains that we're operating is a key element. That plus the collaboration, making sure everyone across that complex network is playing a part and is, playing to the same tune. I wonder if any other panelists want to jump in there.
I was very interested with Magdi's point on it's not a chain. It's maybe a network or an ecosystem. Just a little bit of something that made me chuckle, actually, is for the last 20 years at Cambridge, every time I talk to industry, we take networks off our academic literature and put chain, because the industry would say, what's a network? It's a supply chain. And every time we took our great thinking that we benefited from knowledge exchange with industry, we'd scrub out chain and put in the network word for the academic publications. And it just does share a little bit about the timeline. Is if we're worried about today, I'm sure if Magdi goes to the office and talks network, they'll probably look at the ceiling. But if he's looking at 10 years or 15 years out, or the partnerships that would need to be built for a net zero world, it's going to be much more of that ecosystem flavor. So I think that's one of the key differences about our different timelines we often talk about. But with the worlds converging, I don't have to get my editor out anymore. So we can maybe stick with the same language. And it does touch on one other issue about language here. Who's responsible for net zero global value chains? It's not just an industry issue, it's a societal issue. And that requires governments to play their role. It requires consumers to also be engaged with products that are greener, if I can use that term. But it also means clarity of measurement. In several panels this week, we've been talking about circularity, circular supply chains. There's no established method for saying what is circular and what is not. So again, net zero, how do we measure it? Do we go back to our supplier base? Do we talk about our factories? Do we talk about the end use of our product? And I think all of that is important for effective collaboration. Getting the right language, getting clear standards and methods and for measurement. And I think that will all help.
Super. Thanks, Jack. Julie, I feel like you had something to say on the topic as well.
Yes, when Magdi said no one has a crystal ball, he's right. But you can arm yourself with the tools and with the insights. So you mentioned the complexity of the tiers in value chains, and really knowing or exposing the hidden risks or the invisible risks. So many companies, might know their tier 1 level risk, but really what's happening with your supplier's supplier. Are they located in Ukraine? Are they in Shanghai? You may think you're aware, but then there's a hidden risk that needs to be exposed. So really having the technology to map as many tiers in your supply chain as possible is really one way to arm yourself going forward.
Super, thanks. Ryan, just wondering if you wanted to add anything. I know we were talking before this session also about measurement, back to Jag's theme there on how we actually measure some of these aspects we're talking about, agility, or also tracking through and getting visibility of the supply chains and what's happening where, lead times, this kind of thing. Did you want to add anything on that topic?
My favorite thing that was said so far was around, it's not a supply chain, it's a circle or a loop is my favorite word, a loop. And because most things in the world don't get better when they get bigger, most things get worse when they get bigger. It's only if you can find something that's a compounding effect and generate some sort of exponential function that it actually gets better with scale. And so most supply chains, you get very big. And if you don't have a really good feedback loop that's quite tight in here, that's actually each time it runs, it gets a little bit better, it's probably going to get worse as it gets bigger and more complex and more overwhelming. As a general principle for building a business is like identify all the compounding loops and ways that your business can actually accelerate and get better every time you run that loop. And to get more tactical here in a supply chain, supply loop, supply circle, is how do you take that demand data, understand what it is almost impossible to predict what consumers are going to do, especially coming out of this pandemic. We've seen so many companies get this wrong and suffer from it. But understand what is happening right now, even if you can't predict it, and make sure that that is tightly on the demand side. And then understand what is your supply latency, how long is it taking to produce goods, and what's happening with transit times on a very granular level. I think one of the challenges that companies have working with freight providers of the world is that it hasn't been really easy to quantify these things. The data's lived across many different systems. Pretty easy for the freight forwarder to tell you that they're 99% on time because they control the data, and then all of a sudden you're planning off of data that's like, is it accurate or not? One of the things that we've tried to do to differentiate here is really actually give accurate transit times. And it often makes us look bad because our transit times are slower than everybody else. But I think over time we can build a brand that our transit times are accurate, even if they're slow. And we've seen that, for example, from China to the US, transit times have tripled over the last 18 months, let's call it, since the early days of the pandemic. And we're putting this in front of you and trying to be the nerds that have distribution curves and show you the expected value, the expected arrival time instead of just, well, what can my sales guys promise? Because my sales guys can promise. My sales guys hate this, by the way. They want to just tell you it's always on time. Don't worry about it. But we're all kind of wedding planners. Is the way I describe it. Is if your wedding planner doesn't tell you that it might rain, and then it rains, it's the wedding planner's fault. That it rained because they didn't give you any backup options and tell you, hey, you could pay extra, and we got a church down the street that you could rent in case it rains. And that's kind of where the logistics profession has to go right now. Is like we're all in the wedding planning business, and we're planning weddings in I don't know what's the rainiest part of Europe, Copenhagen or something.
So maybe, Ryan, we can bring it back to the point on circularity, but then bring it back to sustainability as well. Yeah. We were talking about how sustainability is really at the heart of the longer-term supply chain resilience, both in terms of getting at the root causes, but also the effects. Now, thinking about the root causes and working towards lower carbon footprint supply chains, what innovations do you think really need to be accelerated to get there faster, to get to net zero supply chains faster?
Oh, well, there's a lot in the physical layer. That are really hard problems. I mean, fossil fuel, the energy density of fossil fuels is very hard to overcome. Hydrogen is a great solution, but to get the same amount of energy, you need 4 times more volume of fuel. Your ship is not going to be as economical, and so there's got to be real hard tech innovation that's way over my pay grade, but I did meet someone here very inspiring yesterday who's doing new next generation nuclear. He insists that in 10 years there'll be nuclear container ships. I'm super skeptical, but that was very inspiring. But I think that's the level of stuff that you want. If you want to fundamentally get us off fossil fuels for aviation especially, but also for shipping, for maritime, you're going to need some hard tech innovation. That said, in the meantime, there's a lot that low-hanging fruit. The simplest thing is we digitized the packing list for all the containers that we ship, about 500,000 TEUs of cargo last year. And we found that on average, these things are only 70% full. You do the geometry on the cardboard boxes that are inside there. There's 30%, probably never get to 100% full, but you can get to 90. There's a lot of extra inefficiency. By the way, this is a huge win on cost too. Like the easiest way to save 20% on logistics is to fill your container all the way up. And of course, reducing carbon footprint. So things like that are just such low-hanging fruit. We put your carbon emissions on every invoice that you get so you can see exactly what it is. And then I do think there's a role for offsetting. It's not my favorite form of carbon getting towards net zero because it has a bit of a sort of a Catholic indulgences feel to it. You can keep sinning as long as you pay for the St. Peter's, but it's better. It's certainly better than nothing. Is to support programs that are, but you have to make sure that they're actually putting that forest into a permanent, permanent kind of role instead of it just gets chopped down 2 years later. So,
Thanks, Ryan. Magdi, I was wondering if we could turn it to you on the innovation topic, particularly in the context of sustainability and Nestlé's sustainability objectives. Are there any innovations that you've seen over recent years or that you think are worth pursuing to reach those objectives?
Firstly, I think sustainability should not be seen as a hurdle or a cost. It should be seen as an opportunity. So that's firstly a mindset change. And when you look at it as an opportunity, of course, we are mainly a food company, and then regenerative agriculture is at the heart of our also sustainability journey, nature positive and all of that. Few examples. Before the war, of course, in Ukraine, we worked a lot with farmers on sunflower, cover crops and things like that. New ideas for tomato as well. And then we learned a lot of things. We looked at our other parts of value chains, our other landscapes. Where can some of those ideas be applied? So being curious also intellectually. And we thought in France, we have a project for wheat, and we could apply a lot of it in France. So I think part of being good at sustainability and innovating is being curious and seizing this as an opportunity. The other one, of course, is around recipes. They go hand in hand, sustainability and innovation. And sometimes crisis gives you a kick, pardon my vocabulary. Crisis gives you this booster, this starter that, oh, now I need to do it. And we have a couple of good examples. We talk about regenerative practices, oil-based fertilizers. With the crunch today, of course, organic fertilizers are becoming more and more interesting. We used to have a recipe in Brazil where we use palm oil from Indonesia. Indonesia has banned the export of palm oil. We moved to coconut oil in Brazil. Why the hell should we bring palm oil from Indonesia to? But that kick has made us discover that there is a lot of other things there that we could do when it comes to recipes. And I can give you hundreds of examples like this. Plant-based is another one. Is another opportunity where, our R&D and what we put to develop plant-based alternatives for dairy, for meat, etc. And we started with really nothing 3 years ago. Today, we have nearly 1 billion Swiss franc turnover for plant-based alternatives. So we need the consumer there. And as, of course, a consumer-facing organization, we need also to communicate this to the consumer. So indeed, whether it is innovating in practices like regenerative agriculture and some examples, like whether it is innovating in recipes, and it's part also of plans A, B, and C. You're talking about the weather forecast and your wedding. That's the same. Do we have in the drawer enough of those ideas? Do we have enough of those plans B and C which work? And it is more tricky in our case because taste remains paramount. for the consumer. If you substitute recipe A with recipe B, you need to have enough experience and enough insight, and you need to test it on the market. So you can't sometimes simply implement it in 24 hours. So being ready for it. So it's all those things, you know, that make sustainability and innovation kind of very closely linked together.
Thanks, and I'm hearing in that, you know, an interesting point for me there is we spoke about agility and what agility actually looks like in practice. We mentioned repurposing assets, you know, early on in the COVID crisis, there was a lot of that. But you mentioned as well looking back into the product itself, potentially redesigning the product, looking for alternative sources, redirecting supply chains, that's all part of it. And you know, the agility point as well, it's not just resilience. You know, clearly we need to be more agile to achieve sustainability targets as well. Julia, I wanted to hand over to you now just to think through or give your view to us on how you believe data and analytics can give us a view into end-to-end supply chains, both from a sustainability but also resilience perspective, and really enhance our ability to drive those two.
Sure. How many people have attended a session about the metaverse so far? A couple? Okay. We talked about it at breakfast yesterday, and I'm going to attend one later. But why do I bring that up? We're actually already doing that in some cases. Many of you might have already mapped your supply chain in a digital fashion, right? You've heard the phrase digital twin. So we're starting to actually move into this augmented reality by mapping our supply chains, whether it's your bill of materials, right? Whether it's your locations, we call them nodes and lanes, right? It could be your facilities, could be your suppliers' facilities, and it could be the lanes, you know, the routes between them. So all of that can be digitally mapped. And we do that. We do that with customers. And then we aggregate all of that information. And then what we do is we have, sometimes it's our meteorologists in terms of weather, sometimes it's the AI modeling, but all of that then we can be prescriptive. And so in your digital twin, along your network, you can see and see what potentially could be happening. And that could be a weather event, that could be political, geopolitical, it could be an insolvency, it could be a lack of an ingredient, like we talk about. So all of those things, data and AI, the combination of those can really, really help mitigate. In terms of sustainability, I actually wanted to talk about technology for that as well. Water. Water is required for every industrial process, and the potential, you know, of water risk it's severe. So it's actually happening right in front of our eyes. And we co-innovate a lot with customers around water risk. You know, where do I build my next facility? Will there be water availability there? So our meteorologists look at this over decades, and water is sort of the first step, and then heat stress. So we're, you know, workforce, the implications of workforce, which, you know, labor is a whole other issue. So these are the types of things that technology and co-innovation, whether it's, you know, public, private, I think really can make an impact.
Thanks. Jack, I'm wondering if you might have a perspective on this, because thinking about data and analytics, you know, one side of that is the data and visibility within one entity, but I guess, you know, again, back to the theme of end-to-end value chains and really getting the power from getting the end-to-end view. Part of the challenge is connecting that data and the analytics potential across different parties within the value chain. Do you have any perspectives to add around that, how collaboration can really drive better use of that data?
Certainly. I think on the data front, there's a number of huge benefits. We've seen, I mean, the old cliche is never let a good crisis go to waste. COVID opened up our eyes as to where the vulnerabilities in our supply chains were. So those organizations with very good systems for tracking where the shipments were, where the materials were, you know, ahead of the game in seeing problems. And that's been seen in a number of organizations. For me, we do need to be careful about the value of information. So more information doesn't necessarily mean more intelligence. So what information do we actually need and want? And how do we leverage that in our future value networks or value chains? Going to the broader sort of sustainability issue, I think there's 4 ways I would look at how supply chains might get reconfigured. I think first, going back to Ryan's point about loops, we've been trying to drive down a global loop. That's moving very quickly to regional networks, less global networks, and indeed in some cases local networks. So I think one of the things is just thinking about our footprint, and it goes hand in hand with net zero. So shorter supply chains give you resilience, shorter supply chains allow circularity. So that's a direction of travel. I think that's becoming very clear-cut. The second area maybe I wanted to share is on the space of production technologies. So here, Council on Advanced Manufacturing and Value Chains has been looking at new production technologies. And wherever you look, you see a number of fabulous innovations ahead. The economies of scale of production are coming down. So less and less the need for large factories on the other side of the world. Again, shortening supply chains, but offering circularity options. So I think that's a very valuable space. Another area of advanced manufacturing technologies, alternative energy, whether it's batteries, whether it's solar, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's nuclear. These may take 10 years, but the landscape will be much more richer, alternatives that value network designers will be able to look at what's working and what's not. I think the third area for me is really engaging with the consumer and just trying to understand, can mass customization actually drive resource efficiency? At the moment, we achieve it in a very ugly way. We can get that mass customization at a very inefficient manner. I think digital technologies, predictive technologies on what customers want, being able to replenish will be vital. So being able to fulfill orders through information. And it comes back to, I think, the fundamental thing about the question on innovation is if we re-look at the way we design our products. So digital design for reuse, digital design for reassembly will also drive a revolution in production. So it'll be, whether it's digital twins, I'm pretty sure will feature, but new advanced technologies will allow that. And then I think you do have a revolution on our hands. Just close off. Sustainability was a negative word maybe a few years ago. It's another cost, it's another charge, it's another consideration. But I actually think it's a huge value-generating opportunity. And the great companies will embrace it and will do very well.
Excellent. Thanks, Jack. So keenly aware we're 15 minutes for time now, and I did want to open up the floor to Q&A. So I'd suggest we move over to that, please.
Thank you. My name is Philippe Monnier from Switzerland. I represent several organizations. I have a question to Mr. Batato. In Japan, Japan used to be the country of tea. Now, maybe partly thanks to Nestlé, it's the country of tea and the country of coffee. And I would like to ask you, do you think that a company like Nestlé, you are able to create some demand to educate, shape the market towards some of your innovative recipes that could be more sustainable?
I take the compliment for Japan, but I have absolutely, and we have absolutely no arrogance to think a minute that we have shifted really a huge country like Japan with fantastic history and culture of food and beverages to away from tea. Or I think what we are for is about giving options to consumers and consumers will pick the options that they find suitable for them. And I think more and more what we need to do is be very transparent with consumers, with what we do. And I think the consumer wants today to know where the product comes from, how it was manufactured, et cetera, et cetera. And we have, again, technology, and I want to use one simple example of what Nespresso, which is a known brand, has done recently. We started with one edition called Kahawa di Congo, which is a coffee for Congo, where we worked a lot with local farmers, but we said, if this is between farmers and us, nobody knows about it, it's probably a bit of a pity. So we teamed up with a small startup, which is becoming now a sort of scale-up, OpenSC. It's based on blockchain technology. It's called Open Supply Chain, where the consumer scans a QR code, and they get to know how many farmers are part of that sleeve of coffee, what type of incentives we paid them, whether financially they received those incentives or not. So that's all through what the consumer can see through this code and the data behind it. And also they can challenge, they can post comments, so they can, interact with us as a company, etc. So I think this is a start. But I think through technology as well and through the way we market things, we can indeed share the benefits of a product, share more scientific information. This was an example of farmers and regenerative agriculture and sustainability, but we could apply that to a lot of things. And I think it is important that we preserve taste, and that's important as well. The taste dimension is important. We adapt the taste to the local culture, because take Nescafe, for example. People think that Nescafe tastes the same throughout the world. It's not true. The Nescafe in the UK is different than the Nescafe in Southern America, because the roasting degree of the coffee beans. So we study, rather than, pushing the consumers and having any arrogance to shift the way they consume. We actually understand. We want to understand what the consumer like and adapt our products to what the consumer like. An Nescafe in the UK is roasted differently, is, for my taste, as of a Mediterranean origin person, is a weak coffee. But this is what is drunk in the UK. In Brazil and other parts of the world will be a much stronger coffee. So we adapt to the consumer taste rather than, wanting to shift. Where we want to push a bit more, this shifting mindset, is new stuff that are good for, Mother Earth. As I mentioned, plant-based. It's not easy we are a dairy company, amongst other things. So when we put dairy alternatives that are plant-based, we need more efforts. Firstly, the taste should be the same or nearly the same. Secondly, to explain through the technology I mentioned the goodies of plant proteins, why it's better for environment, and why a mixed is better for good for you, good for the environment, good for the planet, and good for your diet. So this is where we make things visible rather than having the arrogance to kind of influence anything.
Thanks. Really interesting points there, and I think, it comes back to the end-to-end visibility theme, but bringing that forward to consumers. Please.
Hi, thank you very much to all of you for the insights. My name's Kimberly Matisse, and I run something called Hub Ocean, which is a center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution under the auspices of World Economic Forum and some others. So we are in the sport of unlocking data to return it as a common good to others. And I believe that we can build a business model that, on the one hand, charges an appropriate fee to industries that we can help rewire to make more profits in a sustainable way, and should pay and take all the money we make from that and make an apparatus which is for the common good. But I have to tell you something you won't be surprised at all by. Unlocking data is rather difficult. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on, you from Nestle. What data can you share with the world that will further our ambitions? And I don't ask it from an activist standpoint, though I should. I really believe that, for example, ocean health and wealth, from a business perspective as well as an environment perspective, is the only way forward for all of us. And so equally, for you who comes, your work, Julie, is very deep into data. How do we get more data shared that should be shared? And I'm not after the competitive secrets to share with everybody. I mean, I've worked in business for 25 years. So you know what I mean? I'm a realist, and I push you to say, how do we really get to the data that should be unlocked and needs to get unlocked? Please, your perspectives from all of you, please.
So I couldn't agree more. Everstream Analytics is actually a participant in WEF's Global Supply System Dashboard. So we fully support that through collective action, we can do common good. And we believe that more data actually makes everyone more powerful. And I just left the governor's session on supply chain this morning, where we talked about data exchange. We talked about trust and what that means. We talked about shared value among constituents, standards that are necessary, right? We can still be creative, but still have some basic standards. And then integration, which we recognize is actually a challenge. When you have mission critical systems already in place, invested in, how can you be interoperable with those? But we fully support that and believe that, yes, we can remain competitive and creative, but still have common good come out of that.
Jack.
Thanks for the great question. Well, there's a very fabulous asset that Mimi and team has developed on data sharing. And you know, what are the incentives for data sharing? In some supply networks, I'm going to call supply networks from now on. Sharing data from my end may actually benefit a partner further down the supply chain. So you know, it may not directly benefit myself. So what are the incentives for data sharing? We often say it's for the general good, but I think we need to go beyond that. So there's some nice frameworks now developed about what are the motivations for data sharing, what are the incentives for data sharing, and how they can be developed within a complex supply chain. So I would urge you to get to that. Your introduction also raised a session we've got at 2:30 today on new business models. And I think if you can't make that into a business model, it probably isn't going to happen. So I think one of the new business models that involve data sharing and value capture by those who are providing the data. So, you know, expressions like "if you don't give, you don't get" have come up in the various conversations that have happened over the last day or two. But I mean, I'd love to hear your thinking on that, perhaps at the session later this afternoon.
Super. Please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Sanjeev. I'm a board member of an organization called Africa Finance Corporation. We are perhaps Africa's largest infrastructure financing company. And from an Africa prism, what kind of intrigues me is that, as you know, we have a lot of stuff that the world needs in terms of primary goods, but very little is actually processed on the continent. And when you see the supply chain challenges that we've had, you talked about the impact of global shipping on general pollution levels, and also the general SDG goals around creating jobs. Is there a better thought being given in terms of sustainability and net zero to process more at source? And there is a case for it, because the typical answer one gets is that there is not enough aggregation. But then there are products that are produced, like cocoa, for example, where almost 70% is produced in 2 countries next to each other. So will we see a bigger realization around producing at source being a solution to the greater problem? Thank you.
I think it's a fascinating question, Magdi.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a potential. There is a big potential of producing at source. Our way to maybe help in that is to, again, put recipes on the market that use local produce. And we have done that in Africa. You might know the Golden Morn product from Nestle. It is done entirely with raw materials that come and are grown in Africa, in Central West Africa region. There are some commodities, we call them now, but there are some agro-produce which are difficult. You know, you took the example of cocoa. I'm not sure in Davos here we could plant cocoa trees and be successful with it, specifically yesterday and today. It's freezing. But so there are things that where you have limiting factors, of course, but there are a lot of things where you can go at source. And again, I think what is important is the feeding of the world has been so far based on 4 main big commodities. If you think of it, it's rice, wheat, maize, and soya in some parts of the world. I think Mother Earth has much more to offer. You have millet, you have spelt, you have oat, you have this and that. And those cassava, and we are putting now more and more recipes of those other alternatives, that most of those other alternatives are really more local and can be local for local recipes. And you cut also on the carbon footprint of transporting this, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot to gain. But again, let's not feel, because otherwise we would be cheating the public and cheating the people to think that everything will be localized simply because of the nature of what it is and simply because there is a consumer pull to still eat chocolate or whatever in some other parts of the world. So we have limitations, but we have a lot of opportunities.
Thanks. And I think we've got just about enough time for one more question. So please.
Thank you very much. I'm Laurent Dublanchet from Air Liquide. We hear a lot about fragmentation, about reshoring, about changing and bouncing back on just what you said about more local. Do you expect some big shifts or redesign on supply chains, and how do you think your models are going to be impacted by that trend, or is it something just a bit far away from now?
I would say it's happening right now, and it has been happening over a few years, but COVID has really accelerated this, and not just COVID, the disease, but the impact from a supply chain perspective. If it takes you 100 days to ship something from China, and if you've got a 25% tariff, just the economics don't make enough sense. And so you're seeing a huge manufacturing boom in the United States right now, for example. It is happening. The labor costs in Mexico 2 years ago became lower than the labor costs in China. So if you're just in China for cheap labor, I think that equation is changing. Now, there's a lot more to producing great products than cheap labor. And you need to have capabilities to actually manufacture stuff, but you're going to see this shift over time for sure, and the market always responds to price incentives, and I think that's one of the important things that we have to keep in mind. We're lucky to live in a market, in a free market economy, most of us in the world, that has price signals. If you don't have it, businesses make bad decisions. You end up in a much worse situation than if you don't have that. So.
Excellent. And I want to respect everyone's time here, conscious we're coming up to the end, but I just wanted to end with any key takeaways or final thoughts, just a quick lightning round from the panelists here. And we can go freeform. Who wants to start?
I'll kick off. I think this connection that you've brought between resilience and net zero is a great one, and I think it's a huge opportunity. I mean, that's the big, whether it's alternative energy, alternative raw materials, alternative crops that are much more water efficient. It's a huge innovation opportunity, and I think going back to the last gentleman's question, inevitably there'll be more local, more regional supply chains as a result.
Thanks. Ryan?
I might just say a lot of this will depend on the consumers demanding sustainability and sustainable products and lower emissions, because I'm not sure that it will always cost less. I mean, I think there are costs, certainly in the transportation world where we live, it costs more if you want to use LNG fuels, or it can cost more to implement these solutions. And if there's no demand from consumers, there won't be demand from customers, from freight buyers to buy these more expensive solutions. Carbon offsetting is not free by definition. So I think tying it back to what is the brand promise that companies are making, how do we get consumers to really buy into that brand promise? I think there's real value creation here. You can make more money if you build the brand the right way and get consumers to buy in. But if consumers don't buy in at the end of the day, I don't think that these things become long-term on their own, take hold. I think it has to be something that people want, and that's a really hard challenge, fundamentally changing consumer taste and what they want.
Thanks, Ryan. Julie?
I agree. At the end, there's a consumer, right? But I also want to say, as a person who's worked in corporate, I've always used the term network. And actually, that's very deliberate because of the circle that we started with. So I just want to end with that it is a circle, and there is a network, and it should be a collaborative network, and one where we all work together as a team. So back to the team sport, winning teams work together and they trust one another.
That's a great theme, Magdi.
I think building on that, everybody realizes the size of the challenge is much bigger than all of us, but also the opportunities are fantastic for all of us. So that's a very good precursor or prerequisite for collaboration. And putting the consumer at the center, because at the end of the day, we think sometimes the consumer is here to judge. Actually, the consumer is part of it, and there is an opportunity also for the consumer. Mainly, simply put, is better nutrition for a better planet. And I think I see my children, my children, they do not want to live in a planet that somehow we, as older people, they think we left them with that planet and with that problem. So I think Generation Z is very active, Generation Y, they are very active people. So I have a lot of hope that the network we talked about can provide with the consumer and putting the consumer at the center better nutrition in a better planet.
Thank you. Great note to end on. So I'd like to thank our panelists very much. Thought it was a great discussion, and to everyone who joined as well. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.